He shall write for himself a copy of this law in a book from the one that is before the priests, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that his heart may not be lifted above his brethren. Today we are continuing our focus on the succession of apostasies and reforms that took place under the kings of Judah. There were many repeated cycles of apostasy that desecrated Solomon's temple, and then subsequent reforms and repairs, and then apostasy and desecration once again, until Judah was finally taken into captivity, and Solomon's temple was destroyed. In our last segment on this subject, we saw that in 885 BC, Athaliah usurped the throne of Judah after Ahaziah had died, and she reigned as queen over Judah for 6 years. Athaliah attempted to kill the entire royal line, all of the male descendants of King David. She succeeded in killing all but one. The Lord used 2 people to preserve the royal line of David. One was Jehosheba, a sister of the recently deceased King Ahaziah. The other person God used to preserve the royal line was Jehoiada, the chief priest in charge of Solomon's temple. Jehosheba and Jehoiada preserved Joash, the infant son of the recently deceased King Ahaziah, and Joash was hidden in Solomon's temple for 7 years, so that he was not killed, and the royal line of David was preserved. We read in 2 Kings chapters 11 and 12 and 2 Chronicles chapters 23 and 24 that the godly high priest Jehoiada exerted a strong spiritual influence on Joash during all but the last year of his long 40-year reign. Jehoiada was responsible for organizing the concealment and protection of the young Joash during the years of Athaliah's illegal reign. Jehoiada arranged for contingents of soldiers to guard the young boy Joash and Solomon's temple in 3 shifts. In 2 Kings chapter 11, beginning at verse 10, we read that this military escort surrounded the boy Joash when Jehoiada brought out the king's son, put the crown on him, and gave him the testimony. They made him king and anointed him, and they clapped their hands and said, "Long live the king." Notice that Jehoiada the priest gave the young king Joash the testimony. What was this testimony? We read in Exodus chapter 25, verse 21, that God commanded Moses to place what he called the testimony in the Ark of the Covenant, in the Holy of Holies of the tabernacle. The testimony initially consisted of the stone tablets on which God had written the 10 Commandments. Psalm 132 gives an account of God's choosing Israel among the nations as his dwelling place on earth above the tabernacle. In Psalm 132, beginning at verse 11, we read this: "The Lord has sworn in truth to David. He will not turn from it. I will set upon your throne the fruit of your body. If your sons will keep my covenant and my testimony, which I shall teach them, their sons also shall sit upon your throne forever." In Deuteronomy chapter 17, beginning at verse 18, God through Moses commanded that each king of Israel was to make his own copy of the testimony, the Mosaic law. The Mosaic law consisted of 3 parts: the moral law of the 10 Commandments, the ceremonial law, setting forth God's prescribed way of worshiping him at the tabernacle and later at the temple, and the civil law for the government of the nation. And so this is what God commanded. Deuteronomy chapter 17, beginning at verse 18. "Also it shall be, when he, that is, any new king, sits on the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write for himself a copy of this law," in other words, this testimony, "in a book, from the one that is before the priests," the Levites. "And it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God and be careful to observe all the words of this law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted above his brethren, that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right hand or to the left. So what was happening here in 2 Kings chapter 11? Jehoiada the priest was giving the newly crowned King Joash the testimony, the Mosaic law, from which Joash the new king was to make his own copy, which was to be his standard for the spiritual and civil government of the kingdom during his entire lifetime. Notice that Joash received this great treasure from the priest of the Lord when he was only 7 years old. It is never too soon to begin the spiritual training of the young. And what was the result? In Joash's case, we read in 2 Kings chapter 12, verse 2, that he did what was right in the sight of the Lord all the days in which Jehoiada the priest instructed him. Clearly, the testimony that Jehoiada had placed in the young king's hands on that first day of his long reign would be the basis for that instruction. And that instruction in the testimony of God continued until Jehoiada died in the 39th year of Joash's 40-year reign. The temple and its worship were to be governed by the testimony of God. In what ways did Joash take this instruction in the law of God to heart? In what ways did he not? In what ways did Joash restore the proper worship of God that the testimony prescribed? The proper worship that had been thoroughly desecrated under Athaliah and the kings who reigned before her? And in what ways did Joash fail? And what happened with Joash in the final year of his reign after Jehoiada died? We find that Joash did not remain true to the Lord, even after all those years of godly instruction. And in that final year of his reign, Joash led the nation in a great wave of apostasy and tragic spiritual betrayal. As we shall see in our next segment, there are several vital lessons in all of this for the church and for individual believers in our time. One of the most vital lessons is this. Spiritually speaking, it is important to observe how an individual begins. But it is far more important to see how an individual ends. Many depart from the truth in their later years. This is too often true even among pastors and other church leaders. The history of Joash's relationship to the temple of the Lord and to the testimony of God is a great object lesson of what can happen when a spiritual leader's outward appearance is shown at the end of his life to be far different from his inward reality. As Jesus told his disciples in Luke chapter 6, verse 45, "A good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good, and an evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart brings forth evil. For out of the abundance of the heart his mouth speaks."